The iron was still glowing red when it pressed against her shoulder blade. The smell of burning flesh mixed with her muffled screams as rough hands held her down on the wooden table. "Property of Blackwood Industries," the foreman growled, stepping back to admire his handiwork. "Now you belong to us, girl." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But what happened 3 years later would shock everyone who witnessed that brutal branding. A mysterious rancher would walk into that compound, pay an astronomical sum, and do something no one expected. This is the story of how one act of unexpected kindness changed everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dust-covered yard of Blackwood Industries labor camp in rural Nevada. Sarah Mitchell stood in line with 47 other workers, her calloused hands clutching a dented metal cup as they waited for their daily ration of watery gruel. The scar on her shoulder blade, hidden beneath her threadbare workshirt, still ached on cold mornings like this one. 3 years had passed since that terrible day when she'd first arrived at this place. She'd been 17 then, desperate and alone after aging out of the foster system in Carson City. The advertisement had seemed like salvation. Guaranteed work, housing, and meals. Build your future with Blackwood Industries. What they hadn't mentioned was that once you signed their contract, you became their property in every way that mattered. The other workers called it the brand, that burning mark that sealed your fate. Every person in this camp bore the same scar, the same symbol of ownership. Sarah had watched dozens of new arrivals receive theirs over the years, their cries echoing through the barracks long into the night. "Move along, Mitchell," barked Supervisor Frank Garrison, his weathered face twisted into its permanent scowl. His clipboard held the daily work assignments, and Sarah knew hers would be the same as always. 12 hours in the industrial laundry, breathing in chemical fumes that made her throat roar and her eyes water. The laundry facility was a converted warehouse with no ventilation, where massive machines churned through loads of hotel linens and restaurant uniforms from across the state. The air was thick with steam and the harsh smell of industrial bleach. Sarah and 15 other women worked in silence, their movements mechanical after years of repetition. "You're falling behind today," sneered Rebecca Torres, one of the newer arrivals who'd quickly learned that currying favor with the supervisors meant making life harder for everyone else. Rebecca had been branded just 6 months ago, but she'd already embraced the twisted hierarchy of the camp. Sarah didn't respond. She'd learned that silence was safer than defiance. Her first year here, she'd tried to fight back, tried to organize the other workers. The punishment had been swift and brutal. 3 days in the isolation box with no food, followed by extra shifts that left her hands bleeding and her body broken. The isolation box was a metal container, barely large enough for one person, sitting in the full Nevada sun with no shade or ventilation. Most people emerged from it broken in spirit as well as body. Sarah had been one of the few who'd retained her will to survive, though she'd learned to hide it better. At lunch, the workers gathered in the mess hall, a long building with picnic tables and a serving window where camp cook Mrs. Elena Vasquez ladled out portions of beans and rice. Elena was different from the other staff. She'd been a worker herself until a back injury made her unable to continue the physical labor. The supervisors had kept her on in the kitchen, and she tried to show small kindnesses when no one was watching. "Eat up, mija," Elena whispered to Sarah as she passed, slipping an extra piece of cornbread onto her tray. These tiny gestures of humanity were rare treasures in a place designed to strip away dignity. Sarah sat at her usual spot at the end of a table, listening to the quiet conversations around her. The workers rarely spoke loudly. Walls had ears. In a place like this, and saying the wrong thing could mean punishment for everyone. "Heard there might be visitors coming next week," whispered Tommy Chen, a young man who worked in the vehicle maintenance shop. "Government inspectors, maybe." "Won't matter," replied Maria Santos, her voice bitter with experience. "They clean everything up when officials come, make us look like regular employees, give us clean clothes, tell us what to say." Sarah had seen it happen before. When state labor inspectors or social workers arrived, the barbed wire came down temporarily. The guards disappeared, and the workers were coached on what to say. Anyone who deviated from the script would face consequences later. The afternoon shift in the laundry was particularly brutal. A delivery truck had arrived with contaminated linens from a hotel outbreak of food poisoning, and the chemical treatment required to sanitize them filled the air with toxic fumes. 3 workers fainted from the exposure, but Supervisor Janet Blake just stepped over them and demanded the others keep working. "Weak stomachs won't get the job done," Blake sneered, her voice cutting through the industrial noise. She was a former worker herself who'd clawed her way into a supervisory position by being more ruthless than anyone else. Mitchell Torres dragged them outside and get back to work. Sarah and Rebecca carried the unconscious workers to the shade behind the building, where Elena appeared with water and damp clothes. "This is getting worse," Elena murmured, checking the pulse of one of the collapsed women. "The chemicals they're using now, they're not safe for human exposure." "Tell that to Blake," Rebecca said with false bravado, though Sarah could see the fear in her eyes. Despite her attempts to ingratiate herself with the supervisors, Rebecca was learning that worker status meant you were expendable regardless of your attitude. The evening brought little relief. Dinner was the same beans and rice, served in the same dented metal bowls. The workers ate quickly and in relative silence, knowing that lingering too long might attract unwanted attention from the guards. After dinner, Sarah walked the perimeter of the camp, a habit she'd developed to clear her head before the cramped barracks and restless sleep. The fence was 12 feet high, topped with razor wire and patrolled by guards with dogs. Beyond it lay the vast Nevada desert, empty and unforgiving, but somehow more appealing than the life inside these walls. The women's barracks housed 32 workers in a space designed for 16. Bunk beds lined the walls, with narrow aisles between them and a single bathroom that barely functioned. The smell of unwashed bodies and desperation hung heavy in the air. Sarah's bunk was in the far corner, a spot she'd fought for because it offered a small measure of privacy. She lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of women crying softly, whispering prayers, or simply trying to breathe through another night. "Sarah," came a whisper from the bunk below. It was Amy Phillips, a middle-aged woman who'd ended up here after a series of bad financial decisions and worse luck. "You think Elena's right about things getting worse?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Things had indeed been getting worse over the past year. The work quotas had increased, the chemical exposure had intensified, and the punishments had become more severe. Several workers had disappeared entirely, officially transferred to other facilities, though no one believed that story. "I think we need to be careful," Sarah finally whispered back, "and we need to look out for each other." It wasn't much of an answer, but it was all she could offer. In a place like this, hope was a dangerous luxury, but small acts of solidarity were sometimes the only thing that kept people human. As the night deepened, Sarah found herself thinking about the world beyond the fence. She remembered her childhood, before the foster system, when her grandmother would tell her stories about brave people who stood up to injustice. Those stories seemed like fairy tales now, but sometimes they were all that kept her going. The brand on her shoulder began to ache again, as it often did when her thoughts turned dark. She touched the scar through her shirt, feeling the raised flesh that marked her as property. But somewhere deep inside, in a place the brand couldn't reach, Sarah Mitchell remained unbroken. Tomorrow would bring another day of industrial chemicals and impossible quotas, another day of surviving in a system designed to crush the human spirit. But tonight, listening to the quiet breathing of women who'd somehow managed to hold on to pieces of themselves despite everything, Sarah allowed herself to believe that survival itself was a form of resistance. The desert wind whistled through, cracks in the barracks walls, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and distant mountains. Somewhere out there, beyond the razor wire and the guards, was a world where people weren't branded like cattle, where labor didn't mean enslavement, where dignity wasn't a crime. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to imagine what that world might look like, never knowing that her liberation was just days away, walking toward her in the form of a mysterious rancher with intentions no one could predict. The black pickup truck appeared on the horizon like a mirage, kicking up dust clouds. As it approached the main gate of Blackwood Industries, Sarah noticed it first from her position at the industrial washing machines, squinting through the grimy window as the vehicle slowed to a stop at the security checkpoint. The man who stepped out was unlike any visitor she'd ever seen at the camp. Tall and lean, wearing a worn leather jacket and boots that had seen real work, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions that mattered. His dark hair was streaked with silver, and when he removed his sunglasses, his eyes held an intensity that made even the guards straighten up. "Name's Jack Crawford," he told the security guard, his voice carrying a slight Texas drawl. "I'm here to see whoever's in charge of labor contracts." Word spread quickly through the camp's informal communication network. Elena heard it first from the kitchen staff, who overheard the guards talking. She passed it to Tommy in the maintenance shop during his lunch break, and he whispered it to Maria as they crossed paths near the storage shed. "Some ranchers here asking about contracts," the message went. "Wants to buy workers for his spread up north." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. This wasn't entirely unusual. Wealthy landowners sometimes contracted with Blackwood for seasonal labor, though the workers rarely returned from such assignments. The official explanation was always that they'd been offered permanent positions, but the cynical reality was that remote ranches provided even fewer opportunities for oversight than the camp itself. What was unusual was the rancher's demeanor. Unlike the other contractors who'd visited over the years, this man didn't seem interested in inspecting the workers like livestock. He spent nearly an hour in the administrative office with Camp Director Vincent Blackwood, and their conversation grew heated enough that raised voices could be heard through the closed door. "I'm not running a charity here, Crawford," Blackwood's voice boomed. "These people owe significant debts for housing, food, and training. The contracts are ironclad." "I understand the terms," came the rancher's measured reply. "That's why I'm prepared to pay full market value plus processing fees." Sarah and the other laundry workers exchanged glances. None of them had ever heard anyone speak to Vincent Blackwood as an equal. The camp director was a man who commanded absolute authority through fear and intimidation, yet this stranger seemed completely unimpressed by his bluster. The negotiations continued for another hour before Crawford emerged from the office, his expression unreadable. He walked slowly through the camp, observing the facilities with the practiced eye of someone who understood hard work and harsh conditions. When his gaze fell on the workers, however, there was something different in his eyes. Not the calculating assessment of a buyer, but something that looked almost like sympathy. That evening, Vincent Blackwood called an unusual assembly. The workers were ordered to gather in the mess hall after dinner, where they stood in nervous rows, while the camp director paced before them like a general reviewing troops. "Some of you may have noticed our visitor today," Blackwood began, his voice carrying its usual edge of barely controlled violence. Mr. Crawford represents a cattle operation in Montana that requires seasonal workers. He's authorized to select up to 10 individuals for immediate transfer. A chill ran through the assembled workers. Transfer meant leaving everything familiar. Even if that familiarity was brutal, it meant separation from the small support networks they'd built, the tiny kindnesses that made survival possible. The selection process will be based on work performance, attitude, and physical capability, Blackwood continued. Those chosen should consider themselves fortunate. Ranch work offers opportunities for advancement that don't exist here. Elena caught Sarah's eye from across the room, her expression worried. They both knew that opportunities for advancement was camp speak for something far more sinister. Workers who left for remote assignments were never heard from again. Crawford himself appeared in the doorway, surveying the assembled workers with those penetrating eyes. He walked slowly among them, occasionally stopping to ask quiet questions. His manner was respectful, almost gentle, which only made the situation more unsettling. When he stopped in front of Sarah, she forced herself to meet his gaze directly. She'd learned that showing fear only made things worse, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice quiet enough that others couldn't hear. "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "How long have you been here, Sarah?" 3 years. He nodded thoughtfully, his eyes taking in details she couldn't interpret. The calluses on her hands, the way she held herself despite exhaustion, the defiance she tried to hide behind compliance. "What kind of work do you do?" "Industrial laundry, chemical processing." Something flickered across his face at that. Anger, perhaps, or disgust. It was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. He moved on to speak with others. Amy Phillips, Tommy Chen, a few of the newer arrivals who hadn't yet learned to camouflage their desperation. Each conversation was brief, respectful, and entirely unlike the dehumanizing interactions the workers were accustomed to. An hour later, Crawford returned to Blackwood's office. The workers were dismissed to their barracks, but sleep was impossible. Whispered conversations filled the darkness as people tried to process what they'd witnessed. "He seemed different," Amy whispered from her bunk below Sarah's. "Almost kind." "Don't be naive," Maria's voice cut through the darkness from across the room. "They're all the same when it comes down to it. We're just inventory to them." But Sarah wasn't so sure. There had been something in Crawford's eyes when he looked at her, something that reminded her of her grandmother's stories about people who stood up to injustice. It was probably wishful thinking, but in a place where hope was dangerous, she found herself clinging to the possibility. The next morning brought an announcement that sent shockwaves through the camp. Crawford had indeed selected 10 workers for transfer, but his choices defied all logic. Instead of the strongest and most compliant, he'd chosen some of the most problematic cases. Workers who'd shown signs of resistance, who'd been disciplined for infractions, who bore the invisible scars of refusing to be completely broken. Sarah's name was on the list. So were Amy's, Tommy's, and Eleanor's, despite her kitchen position. Also selected were Marcus Williams, a former teacher who'd ended up at the camp after a bankruptcy. Jennifer Lee, who'd been caught trying to smuggle letters to the outside world. David Rodriguez, who'd been punished repeatedly for helping injured workers. Lisa Parker, a former nurse whose medical knowledge made her valuable but also dangerous. Raymond Jackson, who'd organized work slowdowns in the vehicle depot. And Rebecca Torres, whose inclusion surprised everyone, including herself. "You leave in 2 hours," Supervisor Frank Garrison announced, his voice filled with unconcealed satisfaction. "Take only what you can carry. No personal items, no contraband, no contact with remaining workers." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of frantic preparation and whispered goodbyes. Elena managed to slip small packages of food to each of the selected workers, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She'd become a mother figure to many of them, and her inclusion in the transfer meant leaving behind workers who depended on her small kindnesses. "Stay strong, mijas," she whispered to Sarah and Amy as they gathered their meager possessions. "Remember who you are inside, no matter what happens." The transport was a large van with tinted windows and reinforced doors, more like a prison transport than a work vehicle. The 10 selected workers climbed inside, finding bench seats and restraint harnesses that confirmed their worst fears about what lay ahead. Crawford was waiting by the van, speaking quietly with Vincent Blackwood. Money changed hands, a substantial sum from the thickness of the envelope, and legal documents were signed with the efficiency of a livestock transaction. "They're your responsibility now," Blackwood said, his voice carrying a warning. "Any problems, any attempts to run, and you'll be held accountable." "Understood," Crawford replied, though something in his tone suggested he had his own interpretation of accountability. The van's engine started with a rumble that vibrated through the metal floor. As they pulled away from the camp, Sarah pressed her face to the small window, watching the razor wire fence disappear behind them. After 3 years of captivity, she was finally leaving Blackwood Industries, though whether she was heading toward freedom or deeper enslavement remained to be seen. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by distant mountains and the occasional cluster of buildings. Crawford drove in silence, his eyes focused on the road ahead, while the workers sat in tense quiet, each lost in their own thoughts and fears. After an hour of driving, something unexpected happened. Crawford pulled over at a rest stop and got out to check something on the van, but instead of the quick mechanical inspection they expected, he walked around to the back doors and opened them. "Anyone need to stretch their legs?" he asked, as if they were passengers on a normal road trip rather than human cargo being transported to an unknown fate. The workers exchanged confused glances. This was completely outside their experience of how transfers worked. Usually, they were treated like dangerous criminals being moved between prisons. "It's okay," Crawford said, noting their hesitation. "There's a restroom inside, and a vending machine if anyone's hungry." One by one, they climbed out of the van, moving stiffly after the hour of confinement. The desert air was clean and sharp, so different from the chemical-laden atmosphere of the camp that it almost hurt to breathe. Crawford handed Tommy a roll of quarters for the vending machine. "Get whatever you want," he said. "We've got a long drive ahead." As the workers dispersed to use the facilities and buy snacks, Sarah found herself standing alone with Crawford by the van. The silence stretched between them until she found the courage to speak. "Where are you really taking us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Crawford looked at her for a long moment, those intense eyes seeming to weigh her carefully. Finally he spoke. "Somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere you can decide for yourself what comes next." It was a cryptic answer, but something in his voice made her want to believe him. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself to hope that freedom might be more than just a fairy tale from her grandmother's stories. As they climbed back into the van and continued their journey into the unknown, none of the 10 workers could have imagined that they were about to discover the true meaning of liberation, or that their mysterious rescuer had been planning this moment for far longer than any of them could have guessed. The Montana landscape unfolded before them like a promise of possibility. Rolling hills covered in golden grass stretched to the horizon, where snow-capped mountains pierced a sky so blue it seemed impossible after years of staring at concrete walls and chemical-stained ceilings. The van had been climbing steadily, for hours, leaving the Nevada desert far behind. Crawford had stopped twice more during the journey, each time treating the workers like actual human beings rather than cargo. He'd bought them real food at a truck stop diner, hamburgers and fries that tasted like heaven after years of institutional slop. When Jennifer Lee had gotten carsick from the winding mountain roads, he'd pulled over and waited patiently while she recovered, even offering her motion sickness pills from a first aid kit. "Almost there," Crawford announced as they crested a ridge. Below them lay a valley that took Sarah's breath away. A crystal-clear river wound through meadows dotted with cattle, while log buildings clustered around what appeared to be the main ranch house. It looked like something from a postcard, too beautiful to be real. The van descended into the valley on a gravel road that eventually became a proper driveway lined with split-rail fencing. As they approached the main compound, Sarah could see people emerging from various buildings, not guards or supervisors, but men and women who moved with the easy confidence of people who belonged where they were. A woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes was waiting on the porch of the main house. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt, her feet planted firmly on the wooden steps as she watched the van approach. When Crawford parked and got out, she walked over to him with obvious familiarity. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice carrying genuine concern. "About as expected," Crawford replied grimly. "The place was worse than we thought. These people have been through hell." The woman's expression hardened. "Well, they're safe now. That's what matters." Crawford opened the van doors and helped the workers out, his movements careful and respectful. The 10 people stood in a cluster, looking around with expressions of confusion and growing amazement. This wasn't what any of them had expected from a cattle ranch operation. "Welcome to Silver Creek Ranch," the woman said, stepping forward with a warm smile. "I'm Margaret Crawford, Jack's wife. You must be exhausted after that long drive." Margaret, wife, ranch. The words didn't compute with what the workers had been told about their destination. They'd expected another labor camp, perhaps more remote and brutal than Blackwood Industries. Instead, they found themselves in what looked like a sanctuary. "I know you're confused," Jack said, his voice gentle but clear. "And I know you have no reason to trust us, but I want you to understand something right now. You are not prisoners here. You are not property. You are free people who have been through a terrible experience, and we're here to help you figure out what comes next." The silence that followed was profound. Rebecca Torres was the first to break it, her voice shaking with disbelief. "What do you mean, free?" "I mean exactly that," Jack replied. "The contracts that bound you to Blackwood Industries have been legally terminated. You don't owe anyone anything. You're free to leave right now if you want, or you can stay here while you decide what you want to do with your lives." Amy Phillips sank to her knees in the gravel, overwhelming sobs racking her body. The others stood in stunned silence, trying to process words they'd almost forgotten the meaning of. Free. It was a concept so foreign after years of captivity that it felt like a word from another language. Elena was the next to react, her maternal instincts kicking in as she knelt beside Amy. "Mija, it's okay," she whispered. "We're okay." But were they? Sarah found herself scanning the horizon, looking for guards, for fences, for the inevitable catch that would reveal this apparent kindness to be another form of cruelty. In her experience, things that seemed too good to be true usually were. Margaret seemed to understand their confusion and fear. "Why don't we get you settled first?" she suggested. "You can process all of this once you've had a chance to rest and eat something decent." She led them toward a long, low building that had the comfortable look of a bunkhouse built for people rather than prisoners. Inside, they found individual rooms with real beds, clean linens, and windows that opened onto views of the valley. Each room had a private bathroom, with hot water and soap that smelled like lavender instead of industrial disinfectant. "Take your time getting cleaned up," Margaret said. "Dinner's at 6, but if you're not ready by then, we'll save you a plate. No schedules, no quotas, no punishments. Just rest." Sarah found herself assigned to a room at the end of the hallway, with windows facing both the mountains and the river. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, afraid to enter, afraid to believe this was real. The room was simple but comfortable, with a quilt-covered bed, a wooden dresser, and a bookshelf filled with novels and magazines. When she finally worked up the courage to use the bathroom, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and gasped. The woman looking back at her was gaunt and hollow-eyed, her hair lank and brittle from chemical exposure. The brand on her shoulder was visible through the thin fabric of her work shirt, a permanent reminder of her years as property. The hot shower was a revelation. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah had unlimited hot water and privacy. She stood under the spray until the water ran cold, washing away layers of grime and chemical residue, watching the drain carry away the physical evidence of her captivity. Clean. Clothes had been laid out on her bed, jeans and a soft cotton shirt that fit surprisingly well. There was also a note in flowing handwriting. "These are yours to keep. If you need anything else, just ask. Margaret." At dinner, the workers gathered in the main house's dining room, a warm space with exposed beams and a stone fireplace. The high table was set with real plates and silverware, not the dented metal bowls they'd grown accustomed to. The food was simple but abundant. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans from the ranch's own garden, and fresh bread that was still warm. From the oven, Jack and Margaret ate with them, treating them as guests rather than charity cases. The conversation was gentle and unforced, with the Crawfords sharing stories about the ranch and their life in Montana. They didn't pry into the workers' experiences, or push for gratitude they weren't ready to give. "How long have you had this place?" Tommy asked, his voice still cautious but growing stronger. 43 years, Jack replied. "Started with nothing but a dream and a lot of debt. Built it up slowly, one good decision at a time. And you just decided to help people like us." Jennifer's question held the skepticism they all felt. Jack and Margaret exchanged a look that spoke of shared history and mutual understanding. "We had help when we needed it," Margaret said simply. "Seems right to pass that along," but Sarah sensed there was more to the story. The way Jack's jaw tightened when he mentioned Blackwood Industries, the careful way he'd observed the workers. At the camp, the substantial sum of money he'd paid without hesitation. This wasn't just random charity, this was personal. After dinner, some of the workers retired to their rooms, overwhelmed by the day's revelations. Others gathered in the living room, where a fire crackled in the stone hearth and comfortable chairs invited conversation. Margaret served coffee in real mugs, and for the first time in years, the former prisoners found themselves in a social situation that felt almost normal. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," David Rodriguez admitted, cradling his coffee. "Mug like a lifeline. This is too good to be real." "I understand that feeling," Jack said from his position by the fireplace. "When you've been hurt badly enough, kindness starts to feel like a trap." "So what's the catch?" Marcus Williams asked, his teacher's instincts cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "What do you want from us?" Jack considered the question carefully before answering. "I want you to remember who you were before. They broke you down. I want you to discover who you can become now that you're free. And if you decide to stay here for a while, I want you to help us continue this work." "What work?" Sarah asked, speaking up for the first time since arriving at the ranch. "Helping people who've been where you've been," Margaret replied. "There are more places like Blackwood Industries than you might think. More people trapped in situations they can't escape from alone." The implications of this statement settled over the group like a heavy blanket. They weren't the first people the Crawfords had rescued, and they wouldn't be the last. This beautiful ranch, this sanctuary, was part of something larger, a network of people working to free others from modern slavery. "The choice is entirely yours," Jack emphasized. "Some people who come here decide to start over somewhere else. We help them with that. New identification, job training, relocation assistance. Others choose to stay and become part of what we're doing. Both paths are valid." As the evening wore on, the workers began to share pieces of their stories. Not the brutal details, those wounds were too fresh, but glimpses of who they'd been before, what they'd lost, what they hoped to find. Elena talked about her grandmother's recipes. Tommy mentioned his love of fixing engines. Amy revealed her secret dream of becoming a teacher. Sarah found herself thinking about her grandmother's stories, about brave people who stood up to injustice. For the first time, she began to understand that she might have the chance to become one of those people herself. Later that night, as she lay in a real bed with clean sheets and a view of stars undimmed by industrial lights, Sarah allowed herself to truly believe that her nightmare was over. The brand on her shoulder would always be with her, a permanent reminder of what she'd survived, but it no longer defined her. She was no longer property. She was no longer a number in someone's ledger. She was Sarah Mitchell, and she was free. This revelation hit her with such force that she had to cover her mouth to muffle her sobs. 3 years of suppressed emotion poured out of her in waves. Grief for the girl she'd been when she first arrived at Blackwood Industries, rage at the system that had enslaved her, and joy at the impossible reality of her liberation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions. She would have to figure out how to rebuild a life that had been stolen from her, how to trust in a future that seemed too good to be real. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Sarah Mitchell slept the deep, peaceful sleep of a free woman. Outside her window, the Montana wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the promise of possibilities she'd almost forgotten how to imagine. The morning sun streamed through Sarah's window, and for a confused moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The absence of harsh fluorescent lights, the silence where factory noise should be, the softness of real sheets against her skin. It all felt like a dream she was afraid to wake from. A gentle knock on her door brought her fully to consciousness. "Sarah, it's Margaret. Breakfast is ready whenever you are, but there's no rush, no rush." 2 words that would have been incomprehensible at Blackwood Industries, where every moment was scheduled, monitored and punished if not used according to someone else's agenda. Sarah dressed in the clothes that had been left for her, marveling again at how they fit, how clean they smelled, how they belonged to her without strings attached. In the dining room, she found several of the others already eating, their conversations subdued but gradually becoming more natural. "Sleep okay?" Eleanor asked, her maternal concern evident as she studied Sarah's face. "Better than I have in years," Sarah admitted, accepting a plate of eggs, bacon, and fresh fruit from Margaret. Jack appeared from what looked like an office, carrying a stack of papers and wearing the expression of someone who'd been up early, handling serious business. He nodded to the group and poured himself coffee, but Sarah noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes didn't quite meet theirs. "Jack's been on the phone with lawyers since 5 this morning," Margaret explained, shooting her husband. A look that mixed pride with worry, making sure all the legal paperwork is ironclad. "What kind of legal paperwork?" Marcus asked, his teacher's instincts immediately picking up on the undercurrents. Jack sat down heavily, suddenly looking older than he had the night before. "The kind that ensures Blackwood Industries can never come after you. The kind that documents their illegal practices. The kind that might prevent other people from going through what you went through." The weight of his words settled over the breakfast table. This wasn't just about their freedom, it was about justice, accountability, and preventing future victims. "You're building a case against them," David said, understanding dawning in his voice. "We're building several cases," Jack confirmed. "Criminal charges, civil suits, federal investigations, but it's complicated, expensive, and dangerous work." Rebecca, who had been quiet since their arrival, suddenly spoke up. "Dangerous how?" Margaret and Jack exchanged another of their meaningful looks before Margaret answered. "People like Vincent Blackwood don't like being exposed. They have money, connections, and very few scruples about how they protect their interests." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. The workers were safe here, but the battle they'd unwittingly become part of was far from over. After breakfast, Jack offered to show them around the ranch, and most of the group accepted, curious about this place that had become their sanctuary. The tour revealed the scope of what the Crawfords had built. Not just a working cattle ranch, but a complex operation designed to help people rebuild their lives. The bunkhouse where they'd spent the night was just one of several residential buildings. Another housed a family of 5 who'd been rescued from a textile factory in California. A smaller cabin sheltered an elderly man who'd been trapped in agricultural labor for over a decade. Each building was designed for privacy and dignity, giving people space to heal without feeling institutionalized. "How many people have you helped?" Amy asked, as they walked past a workshop where someone was teaching furniture making. "Over the years, maybe 300, Margaret replied. "Some stay for a few weeks, some for years. A few have decided to make this their permanent home." They visited the workshop, where a man named Carlos was carefully sanding a wooden chair while explaining techniques to 2 attentive students. He looked up as they approached, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "New arrivals?" he asked, wiping sawdust from his hands. "Welcome to freedom, friends." Carlos had been at the ranch for 5 years, Jack explained, after being rescued from a construction crew that had held workers in debt bondage. He'd discovered a talent for woodworking and now taught others while building furniture that was sold to support the ranch's operations. "The work we do here isn't charity," Jack emphasized as they continued the tour. "Everyone contributes according to their abilities and interests. Some people work with the cattle, others maintain the buildings, some handle administration or legal work. A few, like Carlos, have developed businesses that help fund our operations." They visited the communication center, a building that looked innocuous from the outside, but housed sophisticated computer equipment and radio systems. A woman named Diana was monitoring multiple screens, tracking what appeared to be news reports and social media feeds. "Information warfare," she explained, when she noticed their curious stares. "Companies like Blackwood Industries rely on secrecy and isolation. When we shine a light on their operations, their business model falls apart." Diana had been a data analyst before being trafficked into forced labor at a technology company. Her skills in digital investigation had proven invaluable in building cases against traffickers and helping law enforcement locate victims. The tour continued to a medical clinic staffed by Dr. Patricia Wong, who had been rescued from a situation where she'd been forced to provide medical care to other trafficked workers. The clinic served both the ranch residents and people in the surrounding community who couldn't afford conventional health care. "Trauma takes many forms," Dr. Wong explained as she showed them the facilities. "Physical injuries heal, but the psychological wounds run deeper. We focus on helping people reclaim their sense of agency and self-worth." Sarah found herself particularly drawn to the library, a cozy building filled with books, computers, and quiet study spaces. The librarian, a soft-spoken woman named Grace, had been trapped in domestic servitude for 8 years before her rescue. "Education is freedom," Grace said, running her hand along a shelf of books. "When they control what you know, they control who you can become. Here, you can learn anything you want." As the day progressed, Sarah began to understand the full scope of what the Crawfords had created. This wasn't just a rescue operation, it was a comprehensive system for helping people rebuild their lives from the ground up. Medical care, legal assistance, job training, education, counseling, and community support were all available to anyone who needed them. But it was also clear that the work came at significant personal cost to Jack and Margaret. During lunch, Sarah noticed the way Margaret's hand shook slightly as she poured coffee, the deep lines around Jack's eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. "How long have you been doing this?" Sarah asked Margaret during a quiet moment. Margaret's expression grew distant. 28 years, she said, "since our daughter was taken. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd sensed there was a personal motivation behind the Crawfords' mission, but she hadn't expected this. "Taken?" Sarah whispered. "She was 16, Margaret continued, her voice steady but hollow with old pain. "Walking home from school in Denver. We never saw her again. The police said she was probably a runaway, but we knew better. She was smart, responsible, happy. Someone took her." Jack appeared beside them, having overheard the conversation. "We spent years searching, hiring private investigators, following every lead. Eventually, we learned about the networks that traffic, people, the businesses that profit from forced labor. We couldn't save our daughter, but we could try to save others." The revelation recontextualized everything Sarah had experienced since leaving Blackwood Industries. The Crawfords' kindness wasn't random charity or even general philanthropy. It was a memorial to their lost child, a way of channeling unbearable grief into something constructive. That evening, the group gathered again in the living room, but the atmosphere was different from the night before. The tour had shown them possibilities they'd never imagined, but it had also revealed the weight of responsibility that came with freedom. "I want to help," Jennifer announced suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet conversation. "I want to be part of this." "Me too," Elena added, her maternal instincts fully engaged. "These people understand what we've been through. They're family." One by one, the others voiced their agreement. Tommy wanted to work in the communications center, using his mechanical skills to maintain equipment. Marcus saw opportunities to develop educational programs. Even Rebecca, who had seemed the most skeptical, expressed interest in learning about the legal aspects of their work. But Jack held up a hand, his expression serious. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, and we'd be honored to have your help. But I need you to understand what you'd be signing up for. This work is dangerous. We've had people threatened, equipment sabotaged, legal challenges that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some of our allies have been attacked, both physically and financially. What happened to your daughter could happen to any of us," Margaret added quietly. "We try to be careful, but there are no guarantees." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated. The risks. They'd just escaped from one dangerous situation. Were they ready to voluntarily enter another? Sarah found herself thinking about her grandmother's stories again, about the people who chose to stand up to injustice despite the personal cost. She thought about the workers still trapped at Blackwood Industries, about the fear in their eyes, about the brands that marked them as property. "I'm staying," she said, her voice clear and determined. "Not just to help, but to fight. They branded me like cattle, but they couldn't break what's inside me. I want to make sure they can't do it to anyone else." Her declaration seemed to crystallize. Something in the group. These weren't just victims anymore. They were survivors, with the power to prevent others from suffering as they had. The transformation from property to people to activists was complete. Jack nodded slowly, pride and concern warring in his expression. "Then tomorrow, we start your real education. Legal procedures, investigative techniques, security protocols, trauma counseling, media relations, everything you'll need to know to do this work effectively and safely." As the group dispersed to their rooms, Sarah felt a sense of purpose she'd never experienced before. The brand on her shoulder would always be with her, but now it represented something different. Not ownership, but survival. Not shame, but strength. Not the end of her story, but the beginning of her fight for justice. The girl who had been marked as property was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who would spend her life ensuring that no one else would bear such marks in silence. The training began at dawn. Sarah stood in the communications center alongside her fellow survivors, watching Diana manipulate multiple computer screens with the precision of a concert pianist. The wall of monitors displayed a bewildering array of information: social, Media feeds, news articles, government databases, and what appeared to be surveillance footage from various locations. Information is our most powerful weapon, Diana explained, her fingers dancing across keyboards as she pulled up files. Every labor trafficking operation has weak points, but you have to know where to look. She clicked through a series of documents that made Sarah's blood run cold. Blackwood Industries wasn't just one isolated camp. It was part of a network spanning 12 states with connections to manufacturers, agricultural operations, and construction companies that generated millions in profits from forced labor. The beauty of their system is its complexity, Diana continued. Shell companies, fake contracts, corrupt officials, intimidated workers who are too afraid to speak out. It's designed to be invisible to casual inspection. Tommy leaned forward, studying a schematic that showed the flow of money through various accounts. How do you track all this? Patience, pattern recognition, and a lot of late nights, Diana replied with a grim smile. But the real breakthrough comes from inside information, people like you who've seen how the system works from the inside. Over the next several hours, they learned about financial forensics, digital surveillance, and the legal frameworks that both enabled and could potentially dismantle trafficking operations. Sarah found herself particularly drawn to the investigative work, her mind sharp and focused in a way it hadn't been since before her captivity. Meanwhile, in another part of the ranch, Elena was working with Dr. Wong to understand trauma counseling techniques. Her natural empathy and maternal instincts made her a powerful advocate for newly rescued workers, but she needed formal training to be most effective. Survivors often blame themselves, Dr. Wong explained as they reviewed case files. They internalize the messages they've received about being worthless, about deserving their treatment. Your role is to help them remember who they were before the trauma. Elena nodded, thinking of the countless workers she'd seen arrive at Blackwood Industries full of hope, only to watch that hope slowly drain away. How do you reach someone who's completely given up? Sometimes you don't at first, Dr. Wong admitted. Sometimes the best you can do is be consistently present, consistently kind, until they're ready to believe they deserve better. In the legal training center, Marcus and Jennifer were learning about the intersection of criminal law, immigration policy, and labor regulations. The complexities were staggering. Victims who were afraid to come forward because of their immigration status. Witnesses who'd been so thoroughly intimidated they refused to testify, evidence that was difficult to obtain without putting more people at risk. The system is designed to favor the traffickers, explained Sarah Chen, the ranch's head legal counsel and a former federal prosecutor. They have resources, connections, and victims who are too scared to fight back. Our job is to level the playing field. She showed them evidence packets from successful prosecutions, photographs, financial records, witness statements, and medical documentation that had brought down operations similar to Blackwood Industries. Every case starts with one brave person willing to speak truth, Sarah Chen continued, someone who decides that their silence won't protect them or others anymore. Rebecca found herself in the media relations workshop, learning how to craft messages that would reach the public without compromising ongoing investigations. The instructor, a former journalist named Keith Morrison, emphasized the power of storytelling in changing public perception. People tune out statistics, Keith explained, but they respond to individual stories, to faces and names and experiences they can relate to. Your job is to humanize an issue that most people prefer to ignore. He showed them examples of effective campaigns that had exposed labor abuses, environmental crimes, and political corruption. The common thread was always personal narrative. Real people with real experiences speaking truth to power. The challenge, Keith continued, is telling your story without becoming a target. The people you're exposing will try to discredit you, intimidate you, or worse. We have to be smarter and more careful than they are. As the days of training continued, Sarah began to understand the full scope of the war they were joining. It wasn't just about Blackwood Industries or even labor trafficking in general. It was about an entire economic system that profited from human misery, protected by layers of legal complexity, political corruption, and public indifference. But she also began to see how effective resistance could be. Diana showed them the results of their previous operations. Facilities shut down, traffickers prosecuted, hundreds of victims freed and helped to rebuild their lives. The work was slow, dangerous, and often heartbreaking, but it was also undeniably effective. 2 weeks into their training, the first test came. Diana's monitoring systems detected unusual activity at a facility in Utah. Increased security, workers being moved in the middle of the night, communication blackouts that suggested something was being hidden. "We think they're liquidating the operation," Diana explained to the assembled team, "moving the most valuable workers to other locations, destroying evidence, preparing to abandon the site." Jack studied the intelligence reports with the focused intensity Sarah had come to associate with his most serious moods. "How many people are we talking about?" "Estimated 40 to 50 workers," Diana replied. "Mostly women and children based on the facility's previous operations." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. Somewhere in Utah, people were experiencing the same terror, the same hopelessness that had defined their own lives just weeks earlier. And those people were about to be scattered to unknown locations where finding them again might be impossible. "What can we do?" Elena asked, her voice tight with emotion. "Officially? Nothing," Jack replied. "We don't have law enforcement authority, and any direct action could compromise ongoing federal investigations." "And unofficially?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jack's expression hardened. "Unofficially, we have assets in the area. People who've worked with us before, who understand the risks and the stakes." Margaret appeared in the doorway, having been monitoring radio communications. "The local contact confirms unusual activity. Trucks moving at night, workers being loaded without their personal belongings. It's happening now." The team looked at each other, seeing their own thoughts reflected in their companions' faces. They'd spent 2 weeks learning about the scope of the trafficking network, about the careful legal and investigative work required to dismantle it properly. But somewhere in Utah, people were suffering right now, and careful legal processes wouldn't save them. "I want to go," Sarah said suddenly, surprising herself with the firmness of her decision. "Absolutely not," Jack replied immediately. "You're not trained for field work, and we don't put survivors at risk by sending them back into dangerous situations." "With respect," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I've been in dangerous situations for 3 years. I know how these places work, how the security systems function, how to move without attracting attention. You need someone who understands the inside." Tommy nodded in agreement. "She's right. We all know things that outsiders wouldn't pick up. On guard rotations, camera blind spots, how workers are housed and moved." "The answer is still no," Margaret said firmly. "We don't risk survivors. That's a fundamental principle of how we operate." But David stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "What if we're not going as victims this time? What if we're going as investigators, as part of the team?" The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could see Jack and Margaret struggling with competing impulses, their protective instincts warring with their recognition of the unique value the survivors could provide. "It's too dangerous," Jack said finally. "These operations are planned months in advance, with extensive security protocols and emergency procedures. You can't just improvise a rescue mission." "But you're not improvising," Jennifer pointed out. "You said you have assets in the area, people who've worked with you before. We could support them, provide intelligence, Help them understand what they're seeing. Diana looked up from her monitors, her expression troubled. The situation is deteriorating faster than expected. If we're going to do anything, it has to be soon. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of time slowing down, the same heightened awareness she'd experienced during the most dangerous moments at Blackwood Industries. This was a decision point, a moment when choices would determine not just their own futures, but the fates of dozens of people they'd never met. "I'm going to Utah," she announced, her voice cutting through the debate. "With or without official sanction. I can't sit here knowing what those people are going through while I'm safe and comfortable." One by one, the others voiced their agreement. Elena, thinking of workers who reminded her of her own children. Tommy, remembering the mechanical systems that could be sabotaged or bypassed. Rebecca, whose experience with the legal system could help document evidence. Marcus, whose teaching background made him skilled at analyzing complex situations quickly. Jack closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked every one of his 63 years. When he opened them again, his expression had shifted from protective to grimly determined. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we do it right. Full operational security, professional backup, legal documentation of everything we observe. And if anything goes wrong, if there's any sign that people are about to be hurt, we abort immediately." Margaret was shaking her head, but Sarah could see the resignation in her eyes. "This is insane. We're talking about walking into an active trafficking operation with minimal preparation and no official backup." Sometimes insane is the only sane response to an insane situation, Elena said quietly. "Those people don't have time for us to follow proper procedures." As the group began planning what would become their first field operation, Sarah felt a strange combination of terror and exhilaration. 3 weeks ago, she'd been property, marked and controlled and powerless. Now she was about to voluntarily enter a dangerous situation to help people she'd never met. The brand on her shoulder seemed to pulse with phantom pain, reminding her of everything she'd survived and everything she'd learned. She was no longer the frightened girl who'd been broken down and rebuilt according to someone else's design. She was Sarah Mitchell, and she was going to war. The Utah desert stretched endlessly under a star-filled sky as Sarah crouched behind a rocky outcrop, her heart hammering against her ribs. 2 miles ahead, the Meridian Processing Facility glowed with harsh industrial lighting, its concrete buildings and razor wire fence creating an all-too-familiar silhouette against the darkness. "Radio check," whispered the voice in her earpiece. Jake Morrison, their tactical coordinator, was positioned on a ridge 1/2 mile to the east, with high-powered cameras and communication equipment. "Sarah here, position Alpha," she whispered back, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Tommy, position Beta," came the reply from her left, where Tommy was concealed near the facility's power distribution box. "Elena, position Gamma." Elena's voice carried a slight tremor, but her determination was unmistakable. She was positioned closest to the workers' quarters, ready to provide assistance if evacuation became necessary. The plan was reconnaissance only, document the illegal conditions, identify the number of workers, and gather evidence for a federal task force that Jack had secretly contacted. But as Sarah studied the facility through her night vision scope, she realized the situation was worse than anyone had anticipated. "Jake, are you seeing this?" she whispered into her radio, focusing on a loading dock where armed guards were herding people into the back of unmarked trucks. "Confirmed," Jake's voice was grim. "Count approximately 15 individuals being loaded into Vehicle 1, another dozen waiting near Vehicle 2. Sarah's blood ran cold as she watched the scene unfold. These weren't workers being transferred to better housing. This was the liquidation Diana had predicted, happening in real time. The people being loaded onto those trucks were disappearing into a network that might never be penetrated again. "We have to do something," Elena's voice crackled through the radio, thick with emotion. "They're taking children, Sarah. I can see children." Through her scope, Sarah confirmed Elena's observation. Several of the figures being loaded into the trucks were clearly too small to be adults. The sight triggered memories of her own arrival at Blackwood Industries. The fear, the confusion, the dawning realization that escape was impossible. Negative. Jake's voice cut through their emotional reactions. "Mission parameters are observation only. We do not have the resources or authority for extraction." But even as Jake spoke, Sarah was moving. Her body seemed to act independently of her conscious mind. Muscle memory from 3 years of survival guiding her toward the fence line. She'd spent weeks learning about proper protocols and legal procedures, but watching children being loaded into trucks destined for who knows where stripped away all considerations except the immediate need to act. "Sarah, what's your position?" Jake's voice carried a note of alarm. "Moving to intercept," Sarah replied, pulling wire cutters from her equipment pack. "I can't watch this happen." "Abort immediately," Jake ordered. "You're compromising the entire operation." But Sarah was already cutting through the outer fence, her movements quick and sure. 3 years of studying guard patterns and security systems at Blackwood Industries had taught her how to move invisibly through industrial facilities. The guards were focused on the loading operation, leaving blind spots that she could exploit. "I'm going in too." Tommy's voice joined the radio. Chatter. "Sarah's right. We can't just watch." "This is insane," Jake protested, but Sarah could hear him repositioning equipment, adapting to their sudden change in mission parameters. Sarah reached the inner fence and paused, studying the pattern of guards and lights. The facility was larger than Blackwood Industries, but followed a similar layout. Administrative buildings near the front, production facilities in the center, worker housing at the back. The trucks were parked between the production area and the housing, creating a narrow window of opportunity. "Elena, can you create a distraction on the south side?" Sarah whispered into her radio. "What kind of distraction?" "Anything that draws attention away from the loading dock. We need 60 seconds to get those people out of the trucks." There was a pause. Then Elena's voice came back with new determination. "Give me 2 minutes to get into position." Sarah used those 2 minutes to study the guards' positions and plan her approach. 6 armed men were supervising the loading operation, while 2 more patrolled the perimeter. The workers being loaded were clearly terrified but passive, their spirits already broken by whatever they'd endured at this facility. A small explosion from the south side of the compound lit up the night sky, followed immediately by the wail of fire alarms. Elena had found something flammable and made good use of it. What the hell was that? Jake's voice carried equal parts admiration and exasperation. "Chemical storage shed," Elena replied calmly. "Might want to call the fire department." The guards immediately reacted to the explosion, half of them running toward the smoke and flames, while the others tried to maintain control of the loading operation. In the confusion, Sarah slipped through the inner fence and sprinted toward the trucks. The first truck's back doors were still open, with people packed inside like cargo. Sarah appeared at the opening, and the workers' eyes went wide with surprise and fear. "I'm here to help," she whispered urgently in English, then repeated the phrase in Spanish. "We're getting you out of here." The workers stared at her in confusion and disbelief. To them, she was just another stranger in the night, possibly another captor with different intentions. Sarah realized she needed to establish trust quickly. "I was at Blackwood Industries in Nevada," she said, rolling up her sleeve to show the brand on her shoulder. "I know what this is. I know what they did to you. But you're not property. You're people. And people deserve to be free." Recognition flickered in several faces. One woman, probably in her 30s with prematurely grey hair, leaned forward. "You escaped?" she whispered. "I was rescued." Sarah replied. "And now we're here to rescue you." The woman translated quickly to the others, and suddenly the truck was alive with whispered conversations in multiple languages. But before they could organize an escape, shouts erupted from the direction of the fire, and Sarah realized the guards were returning. "Tommy, where are you?" she whispered into her radio. "Disabling vehicles," Tommy replied. "Give me 30 more seconds." "We don't have 30 seconds. Sarah made a split-second decision that would haunt her for months afterward. Instead of trying to evacuate the workers, she climbed into the truck with them. "What are you doing?" the grey-haired woman asked. "Coming with you," Sarah replied, pulling the truck doors closed from the inside, just as the guards returned to the loading area. "Sarah, report your position," Jake's voice crackled through her earpiece, but she couldn't respond without alerting the guards to her presence. The truck's engine started, and Sarah felt the familiar sensation of being transported to an unknown destination, powerless to control her fate. But this time was different. This time she had training, equipment, and people who knew where she was going. This time she was choosing to enter captivity as part of a larger plan. As the truck pulled away from the facility, Sarah activated a small GPS tracking device and placed it carefully behind a wheel well where it wouldn't be easily discovered. Then she settled in among the other workers, preparing for whatever lay ahead. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she whispered to the woman beside her. "I work with people who rescue trafficking victims. Help is coming, but we need to survive long enough for them to find us." The woman studied Sarah's face in the dim light, filtering through the truck's small windows. "I'm Carmen Rodriguez. I've been here 8 months. "How many facilities like this one are there?" Sarah asked. 5 that I know of," Carmen replied. "They move us between them depending on contracts and inspections. This is the 3rd place I've been." As the truck traveled through the night, Sarah learned more about the network they were fighting. Carmen and the others described a system far more sophisticated than what they'd encountered at Blackwood Industries. Multiple facilities, rotating, schedules that prevented workers from forming strong bonds, psychological manipulation techniques that kept people passive and compliant. "They tell us our families will be hurt if we cause trouble," explained a young man named Miguel. "They show us photographs, addresses, school schedules. How do you fight people who threaten everyone you love?" Sarah didn't have an easy answer to that question, but she understood something that traffickers didn't expect. Fear worked both ways. The people who profited from human misery were about to discover that their victims had learned to fight back. Hours passed before the truck finally stopped. Through the small windows, Sarah could see another industrial facility, this one even more isolated than the last. The landscape was completely barren. No roads, no buildings, no signs of civilization in any direction. The truck doors opened, and guards with flashlights began ordering people out. Sarah kept her head down and moved with the group, using techniques she'd learned during her training to memorize details about the new facility. This place was different from both Blackwood Industries and the Utah facility. The buildings were newer, the security more sophisticated, and the guards carried themselves with the professional bearing of people who took their work seriously. This wasn't just a labor camp. This was the kind of high-security facility where the most valuable and dangerous prisoners were kept. As they were herded into a processing building, Sarah caught sight of something that made her blood freeze. Standing near the entrance, reviewing paperwork with obvious authority, was Vincent Blackwood himself. Her former captor had aged in the weeks since she'd seen him, his face bearing new lines of stress and his movements more agitated than she remembered. But his eyes still held the same cold calculation that had terrorized workers for years. Sarah pulled her hood up and kept her head down, praying that 3 weeks of better nutrition and freedom hadn't changed her appearance enough to be recognizable. As she shuffled past him with the other new arrivals, she heard him giving instructions to his subordinates. Process them quickly and get them to housing. We're moving again tomorrow night, and I want everyone ready for transport. Moving again. That meant this facility was also temporary, part of the liquidation process that would scatter the workers to locations across the country. If they were going to be rescued, it had to happen soon. As the workers were led to a holding area, Sarah activated her radio for a quick burst transmission. Package delivered to secondary location. Blackwood on site. Time critical. She could only hope that Jake and the others had tracked her GPS signal and were already mobilizing the federal task force. Because looking around at the faces of the 47 other people trapped in this facility, Sarah realized that failure wasn't just about missing an opportunity for justice. Failure meant that all of these people would disappear forever into a system designed to erase their very existence. And Sarah Mitchell, despite all her training and preparation, despite her transformation from victim to activist, might disappear right along with them. The holding area was a windowless concrete room with fluorescent lights that buzzed incessantly overhead. 48 people sat on metal benches or stood against the walls, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. Sarah positioned herself in a corner where she could observe both the other prisoners and the guards stationed at the single entrance. The facility's layout was becoming clearer with each passing hour. Unlike the chaotic sprawl of Blackwood Industries, this place was designed with military precision. Guard rotations were exact, camera coverage was comprehensive, and the workers were kept in smaller groups to prevent organization or communication. "First time here?" whispered Carmen, settling beside Sarah on the cold metal bench. "First time anywhere like this," Sarah lied, maintaining her cover while gathering intelligence. "I was working construction in Phoenix when they grabbed me." Carmen nodded grimly. "They got me from a hotel cleaning job in Las Vegas, promised better wages, steady work. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late." Around them, other workers shared similar stories in hushed tones. Miguel had been recruited from a day labor center in El Paso. A teenager named Ana had been promised modeling work. In Los Angeles, an older man called Santos had been caught trying to cross the border and forced into debt bondage. Each story followed the same pattern: vulnerability exploited by people who understood exactly how to identify and manipulate victims. But Sarah also noticed something else in their whispered conversations, a spark of resistance that hadn't been completely extinguished. "Has anyone ever tried to escape from here?" Sarah asked carefully. Carmen's expression darkened. "There was. A woman last month, Maria Santos. She made it to the fence before they caught her. What happened to her?" "They made an example," Carmen replied, her voice barely audible, "in front of everyone, to show us what happens when people try to run." Sarah felt her jaw clench with familiar rage, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was exactly why the work Jack and Margaret were doing mattered so much. These people didn't just need rescue. They needed to know that resistance was possible, that they weren't alone, that someone was fighting for them. The door opened with a harsh metallic clang, and Vincent Blackwood entered with 2 guards. Sarah immediately looked down, hunching her shoulders and pulling her hood lower. Her heart hammered as Blackwood's footsteps echoed across the concrete floor. "Listen carefully," Blackwood announced, his voice carrying the same authoritative cruelty Sarah remembered from Nevada. "This facility is being relocated for operational reasons. You will be divided into groups and transported to new assignments. Your cooperation during this transition will determine your treatment at your new locations." He gestured to one of the guards, who began reading names from a clipboard. Sarah listened intently, memorizing the names and trying to understand the selection criteria. Some workers were assigned to agricultural operations, others to manufacturing facilities, a few to what were euphemistically called domestic service positions. When the guard reached Sarah's false name, Jane Morales, the identity she'd created during processing, she was assigned to something called the Meridian Mountain Lodge. Carmen grabbed her arm with barely concealed panic. "No," she whispered urgently. "Not the lodge. Anything but the lodge." "What's the lodge?" Sarah whispered back. "It's where they send the ones who cause trouble, or the ones they want to disappear." Sarah's blood ran cold, but she forced herself to think tactically. If the lodge was where problems were eliminated, it was also likely where Vincent Blackwood would be personally involved, which meant it might be her best chance to gather evidence and identify the key players in the organization. As the workers were separated into their assigned groups, Sarah found herself with 6 others, all women, all relatively young, all bearing the subtle signs of people who hadn't been completely broken by their experiences. Carmen was right. This wasn't a work assignment. This was a death sentence. But Sarah had advantages these other women didn't. Hidden in her clothing were 2 GPS tracking devices, a recording device no bigger than a button, and an encrypted satellite phone that could transmit her location to the federal task force. She also had something more valuable than any equipment. She had hope and people who were coming for her. The transport to Meridian Mountain Lodge took place in the middle of the night, following back roads that wound higher into mountains Sarah couldn't identify. The other women sat in terrified silence, but Sarah used the journey to memorize landmarks and estimate distances. The lodge itself was a grotesque parody of a vacation resort. From the outside, it looked like an expensive mountain retreat with log buildings, landscaped grounds, and scenic views. But the windows were barred, the doors were reinforced steel, and motion sensors tracked movement throughout the property. "Welcome to your new home," sneered the guard, who processed their arrival. "Mr. Blackwood has special plans for each of you." They were housed in what had once been guest rooms, but now served as cells. Sarah's room contained a single bed, a metal toilet, and a window that offered a view of the surrounding wilderness. More importantly, it contained something the designers hadn't intended, a loose floorboard that provided access to the building's electrical and communication systems. Sarah waited until the late hours of the night before beginning her real work. Using tools hidden in her clothing, she carefully pried up the floorboard and accessed the wiring beneath. Her training with Diana had included basic electronics, and she was able to tap into the lodge's internal communication system. What she heard made her understand why Carmen had been so terrified. Vincent Blackwood was on the phone with someone he addressed as Senator, discussing arrangements for what he called permanent disposal of problematic assets. The conversation made it clear that the lodge wasn't just an elimination facility. It was connected to powerful people who had a vested interest in keeping trafficking operations hidden. "The federal task force is getting too close," Blackwood was saying. "We need to clean the house completely. No witnesses, no evidence, no loose ends." "And the Crawford operation," came the voice from the other end. "Being handled as we speak. Our people are already in position in Montana." Sarah's heart stopped. Jack and Margaret were in danger, possibly under attack at this very moment. The GPS tracking devices that were supposed to lead to her rescue might instead be leading her allies into a trap. She activated her encrypted satellite phone and sent an emergency burst transmission. "Blackwood aware of Crawford operation. Montana. Location compromised. Federal task force infiltrated. Trust no one. Evidence at Meridian Mountain Lodge. Coordinates follow." The response came back within minutes. "Message received. Alternate rescue plan activated. Hold position. 72 hours maximum." 72 hours. Sarah had to survive in this place for 3 days while gathering evidence that could dismantle the entire network. And she had to do it while 6 other women counted on her to keep them alive. The next morning brought a horrifying revelation of what the lodge was actually used for. Sarah was taken with the other women to what Blackwood called an orientation session in the lodge's main conference room. But instead of work assignments, they were presented to a group of men in expensive suits who examined them like livestock. "These are the last of the problematic cases," Blackwood explained to his visitors. "All of them have shown signs of resistance or possess information that could be damaging to our operations." One of the men, distinguished and silver-haired in a way that suggested political power, studied the women with cold calculation. "What are you proposing?" "Complete elimination," Blackwood replied matter-of-factly. "Arranged to look like accidents or disappearances. We've already prepared the paperwork, showing they were transferred to facilities in Mexico." Sarah fought to keep her expression neutral while her mind raced. These weren't just trafficking victims. They were witnesses to be murdered. And the men in suits weren't just clients. They were the political and business leaders who made the entire system possible. "The federal investigation concerns me," another man said. Sarah recognized his voice from news broadcasts, a congressman who served on the Judiciary Committee. "How do we know this won't trace back to us? The investigation is being handled," Blackwood assured him. "Our contact in the Justice Department has ensured that certain evidence will disappear and certain witnesses will be discredited." As the meeting continued, Sarah realized the scope of corruption they were facing. This wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. The people who were supposed to protect trafficking victims were instead protecting the traffickers. But she also realized something else. These powerful men were scared. The rescue operations, the federal investigations, the growing public awareness, it was all working. They were so threatened that they were willing to commit murder to protect their interests, which meant Sarah and the other women represented more than just potential victims. They represented evidence that could bring down the entire network. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting for rescue, she began organizing the other women for escape. Using skills she'd learned during her training, she showed them how to pick locks, how to disable security systems, and how to move silently through hostile territory. "Why should we trust you?" asked one of the women, a nurse named Patricia, who'd been trapped in the system for over 2 years. Sarah rolled up her sleeve, showing them the brand that marked her as a survivor. "Because I've been where you are. Because I know what it feels like to be property, and because I know that we're stronger together than we are alone." One by one, the women committed to the escape plan. They would move during the shift change. At 3 a.m., when security was momentarily reduced, Sarah would disable the alarm system while the others created a distraction. They would have perhaps 10 minutes to reach the tree line before pursuit began. It was a desperate plan, with minimal chances of success. But as Sarah looked at the faces of the women who had chosen to trust her, she realized that success wasn't just about escaping. It was about refusing to be victims, about fighting back against people who thought they were powerless. In 72 hours, federal agents would storm the lodge and find evidence of the conspiracy. In 72 hours, Vincent Blackwood and his associates would face justice for their crimes. But tonight, 6 women would discover that freedom wasn't something that could be given or taken away. Freedom was something you fought for, something you claimed for yourself, something you shared with others who had the courage to believe they deserved better. As Sarah prepared for what might be her final battle, she thought about her grandmothers. Stories one more time. Stories about brave people who stood up to injustice, who refused to accept that some humans could own other humans, who believed that every person had the right to determine their own destiny. Tomorrow, she would either be free or she would be dead. But tonight, she was exactly what her grandmother had always said she could be, a person who fought for what was right, no matter the cost. The digital clock on the wall read 2:47 a.m. when Sarah carefully removed the loose floorboard for the final time. Beneath her, the building's electrical systems hummed with the quiet efficiency that would soon become chaos. She had 13 minutes before the shift change. 13 minutes to disable enough security systems to give 6 women a chance at freedom. Her hands moved with practiced precision, disconnecting motion sensors and camera feeds in a sequence that would appear random to monitoring systems. Each wire she cut represented months of training, hours of studying building schematics, and the desperate hope that her actions might save more than just the women in this facility. Through the thin walls, she could hear Patricia whispering final instructions to the others. The nurse had become Sarah's lieutenant in the escape plan, her medical knowledge crucial for treating injuries, and her natural authority helping to keep the group focused despite their terror. "Remember," Patricia's voice was barely audible, "we stay together until we reach the tree line. No one gets left behind, no matter what happens." Sarah finished with the security systems and moved to the communication equipment she'd been secretly accessing for 2 days. The conversations she'd recorded between Blackwood and his political allies were stored on an encrypted memory card, no bigger than her thumbnail. This evidence could bring down the entire network if it survived what was about to happen. At 2:58 a.m., Sarah sent her final transmission to the Federal Task Force. "Evidence secured. Beginning extraction. If we don't make contact in 6 hours, assume casualties and proceed with the raid." The response was immediate. "Negative on solo extraction. Federal assets inbound. Maintain position." But Sarah was already moving toward the door. Maintaining position meant waiting for rescue that might never come, trusting in systems that had been infiltrated by the very people they were fighting. The 6 women counting on her couldn't afford to wait for bureaucratic solutions. She picked the lock on her door with tools fashioned from electrical wire, her movements silent and sure. The hallway beyond was dimly lit by emergency lighting, casting long shadows that provided cover as she moved toward the other rooms. One by one, she freed the other women. Carmen emerged from her cell with tears streaming down her face, unable to believe that escape was actually happening. Anna, the teenager who'd been promised modeling work, clutched a makeshift weapon, a jagged piece of metal she'd broken off from her bed frame. "The guards will be changing shifts in 7 minutes, Sarah whispered as the group assembled in the hallway. "Patricia, take point. I'll handle rear security. Everyone else stays between us." They moved through the lodge like ghosts, using the building's layout that Sarah had memorized during her reconnaissance. The main exit was heavily monitored, but the kitchen had a service entrance that led to the loading dock. From there, it was 50 yards of open ground to the forest that surrounded the facility. The kitchen was empty except for the industrial equipment that hummed quietly in the darkness. Sarah led the group past stainless steel counters and walk-in freezers, her heart hammering as they approached the service door. But as she reached for the door handle, floodlights suddenly blazed to life outside, turning night into harsh artificial day. Alarms began wailing throughout the facility, and the sound of running feet echoed from multiple directions. "They know," Carmen whispered, her voice tight with panic. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. The security systems she'd disabled should have given them more time. Unless someone had been watching them, waiting for exactly this moment, the truth hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't a failure of their escape plan. It was a trap. Blackwood had known about her infiltration from the beginning, had allowed her to gather evidence and organize the other women, all so he could catch them in the act and eliminate them with justification. "What do we do?" Patricia asked, looking to Sarah for leadership even as their situation collapsed around them. Sarah looked at the faces of the women who had trusted her, who had chosen to believe that freedom was possible. She could surrender, try to negotiate, hope that the approaching federal agents would arrive in time to prevent a massacre, or she could do what her grandmother's stories had always taught her: fight back, even when victory seemed impossible. "We keep going," she said firmly. "They want us to be afraid, to give up, but we're not property anymore. We're not victims. We're fighters." She opened the service door despite the blazing lights and stepped out onto the loading dock. Guards were converging from multiple directions, their flashlights cutting through the artificial day created by the security lighting. "Stop right there!" shouted a voice that Sarah recognized as Vincent Blackwood's. He emerged from the shadows with a pistol in his hand, his face twisted with rage and satisfaction. "Did you really think I didn't know who you were, Sarah Mitchell? Did you think I wouldn't recognize one of my own property?" Sarah stepped forward, shielding the other women with her body. "I'm not your property," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the loading dock. "None of us are. We're human beings, and human beings can't be owned." Blackwood laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Human beings! You're criminals who have destroyed millions of dollars in carefully constructed operations. You're terrorists who have corrupted good workers with fantasies of escape." "We're survivors," Sarah replied, "and we're not alone." As if summoned by her words, the sound of helicopters began to echo through the mountain valley. Searchlights swept across the facility as federal agents fast roped onto the lodge's rooftops and surrounded the perimeter. But Blackwood's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked more satisfied. "Let me tell you what's really going to happen here," he said, raising his voice so the approaching agents could hear. Dangerous criminals attempted to escape from a federal holding facility. In the ensuing confrontation, several prisoners were killed while attacking guards. Tragic, but necessary for public safety. Sarah realized with growing horror that Blackwood intended to murder them in front of federal agents, then claim self-defense. The corruption went so deep that he believed his political connections would protect him even from this. "Senator Morrison has already prepared the necessary paperwork," Blackwood continued. "Congressional Representative Hayes will ensure that any investigation reaches the correct conclusions, and Deputy Attorney General Williams will make certain that inconvenient evidence disappears." But as Blackwood spoke, Sarah noticed something he hadn't. The federal agents weren't taking positions to support him. They were surrounding his guards, weapons drawn and ready. These weren't corrupted officials. These were the clean agents that Jake Morrison and the Crawford operation had carefully cultivated. "Vincent Blackwood," called a voice amplified by a bullhorn. "This is FBI Special Agent Maria Santos. You are surrounded. Drop your weapon and surrender immediately." For the first time since Sarah had known him, Vincent Blackwood looked uncertain. His political connections, his carefully purchased protection, his network of corruption. None of it was working the way it was supposed to. "This is impossible," he muttered, his gun wavering as he tried to process what was happening. "Senator Morrison assured me. Senator Morrison is currently being arrested at his home in Washington." Agent Santos's voice cut through his confusion. "Along with Representative Hayes, Deputy Attorney General Williams, and 47 other co-conspirators. Your network is finished." The guards, who had been supporting Blackwood, began to lower their weapons, realizing that their protection had evaporated. But Blackwood himself seemed to snap, his face contorting with rage as he raised his pistol toward Sarah. "If I'm finished, then so are you," he snarled. Time seemed to slow as Sarah watched his finger tighten on the trigger. She had faced death before, had accepted it as the price of fighting for justice. But she had never expected to die as a free woman, surrounded by people who had chosen to stand with her against impossible odds. The gunshot, when it came, was deafeningly loud in the mountain air. But the pain Sarah expected never arrived. Instead, Vincent Blackwood staggered backward, his weapon clattering to the concrete as he clutched his shoulder. Behind him, Patricia stood with a smoking pistol in her hands, a weapon she'd taken from a guard during the confusion. "I'm a nurse," Patricia said calmly as federal agents swarmed the loading dock. "I took an oath to do no harm." But that doesn't mean I have to let harm be done to others. As Blackwood was taken into custody, Sarah found herself surrounded by the women she'd helped to free. They were crying, laughing, holding each other with the desperate relief of people who had never expected to see another sunrise. Agent Santos approached the group, her expression mixing professional efficiency with genuine compassion. "You're safe now," she said. "All of you. The network that held you has been dismantled, and the people responsible are being arrested across the country." "How many facilities?" Sarah asked, thinking of all the workers who were still trapped in similar situations. 18 major operations, 43 smaller ones," Agent Santos replied. "Over 800 people were freed in coordinated raids. This morning, the largest human trafficking network in American history ceased to exist. As medical personnel checked the women for injuries and federal agents began processing the scene, Sarah felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The nightmare was finally over, but the real work was just beginning. Because freedom, she had learned, wasn't just about escaping captivity. It was about building a world where captivity couldn't exist, where people like Vincent Blackwood couldn't profit from human misery, where survivors could transform their trauma into strength that helped others. The helicopter that carried them, away from Meridian Mountain Lodge, flew low over the forest, giving Sarah a final view of the facility that had been intended as her tomb. But instead of death, it had become the place where she fully claimed her identity as a fighter for justice. The brand on her shoulder would always be with her, a permanent reminder of what she had survived. But now it represented something different, not ownership, but the strength that came from refusing to be owned. Not shame, but pride in survival. Not the end of her story, but the beginning of her mission to ensure that no one else would bear such marks in silence. Below them, the mountains stretched endlessly toward the horizon, beautiful and free under the morning sun. And somewhere in that vast landscape, Sarah Mitchell knew that other survivors were beginning their own journeys from captivity to freedom, from victimhood to power, from property to people. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time in 4 years, Sarah was ready to face that fight as a free woman, with allies who shared her determination to build a better world. 6 months after the raids that dismantled the largest trafficking network in American history, Sarah stood before a Senate subcommittee in Washington, D.C., her hands steady as she adjusted the microphone. The marble-walled hearing room was packed with journalists, advocates, and families of trafficking victims, all waiting to hear testimony that would shape legislation for years to come. "Senator Williams, members of the committee," Sarah began, her voice clear and strong. "My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I was branded like cattle by people who believed they owned me." She rolled up her sleeve, showing the scar that had once marked her as property, but now served as evidence of survival. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the assembled crowd like a heavy blanket. "But I'm not here today to talk about what was done to me. I'm here to talk about what we can do to ensure it never happens to anyone else." The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, congressional hearings, and media interviews. The evidence Sarah and the other survivors had gathered led to the conviction of Vincent Blackwood and 43 co-conspirators, including 3 senators, 5 representatives, 2 federal judges, and dozens of business leaders who had profited from forced labor. But the legal victories were just the beginning. The real work was happening at Silver Creek Ranch, which had become the headquarters for a national network of survivor-led organizations dedicated to prevention, rescue, and rehabilitation. Jack and Margaret Crawford sat in the front row of the hearing room, their faces showing the pride and concern of parents watching their child take on the world. They had survived the attempt on their lives, barely. The attack on the ranch had been thwarted by security measures they'd put in place years earlier, but it had served as a stark reminder of the dangers inherent in their work. The Trafficking Survivors Protection Act that this committee is considering, Sarah continued, represents more than just policy changes. It represents a fundamental shift in how our society views and treats the victims of modern slavery. The legislation she was advocating for had been drafted by survivors themselves, with input from rescue organizations, law enforcement, and legal experts. It addressed gaps in existing laws that traffickers had exploited, provided comprehensive support for survivors, and created new mechanisms for investigating and prosecuting trafficking cases. Under current law, Sarah explained, survivors are often treated as criminals rather than victims. They're arrested for prostitution, immigration violations, or document fraud, crimes they were forced to commit by their traffickers. This bill would change that, providing immunity for survivors and recognizing that they were acting under duress. Senator Patricia Hayes, no relation to the corrupted representative who had been arrested, leaned forward with obvious interest. Ms. Mitchell, can you speak to the rehabilitation programs outlined in Section 4 of the bill? Sarah nodded, thinking of the dozens of survivors she'd worked with over the past months. Senator, freedom is more than just the absence of chains. People who have been trafficked need comprehensive support to rebuild their lives. Medical care, psychological counseling, job training, education, legal assistance, and safe housing. But most importantly, they need to be involved in their own recovery. She gestured toward the gallery, where Carmen Rodriguez sat with her 2 children, who had been reunited with her after the raids. Traditional victim services often reinforce the powerlessness that trafficking creates. Survivor-led programs recognize that the people who have overcome these experiences are the ones best qualified to help others do the same. The questioning continued for 3 hours, with senators probing every aspect of the proposed legislation. Sarah answered each question with the authority that came from lived experience, backed by the expertise she'd gained through months of intensive training and advocacy work. During a break, she stepped into the hallway and was immediately surrounded by reporters and advocates. But the person she was most happy to see was Tommy Chen, who had become the lead investigator for the Crawford organization's digital forensics unit. "How's it going in there?" he asked, his expression mixing pride with concern. "Better than expected," Sarah replied. "Senator Williams seems genuinely committed to passing comprehensive legislation. The others are still playing politics, but the momentum is building." Tommy nodded, then lowered his voice. "We've got a new situation developing. Diana picked up chatter about operations in Florida and Texas. Looks like some of the smaller fish are trying to rebuild." Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with the hunt. Despite her success as an advocate and policy expert, fieldwork remained her passion. There was something deeply satisfying about personally dismantling the operations that preyed on vulnerable people. "How soon?" she asked. "Coordinated raids are planned for next week. Jake wants you and Elena to lead the survivor support teams." The survivor support teams were Sarah's innovation, groups of trafficking survivors who provided immediate assistance to newly rescued victims. Their presence helped establish trust and hope in situations where traditional law enforcement might be viewed with suspicion or fear. "Tell Jake I'll be there," Sarah said, then added with a grin, "after I finish convincing these senators to do their jobs." The afternoon session focused on the economic aspects of trafficking, an area where Sarah's inside knowledge proved invaluable. She walked the committee through the financial structures that made forced labor profitable, explaining how legitimate businesses often unknowingly purchased products made with trafficked labor. "The chocolate in your morning coffee, the clothes you're wearing, the device you're using to take notes," Sarah said, her voice carrying a weight that made several senators shift uncomfortably. Any of these could have been produced using forced labor. The supply chains are deliberately complex to hide these connections. Senator Robert Davis, a conservative member who had been skeptical of the legislation, asked the question that Sarah had been waiting for. Ms. Mitchell, this bill would require extensive monitoring and enforcement mechanisms. How do we know the benefits justify the costs? Sarah looked directly at him, her expression serious but not confrontational. Senator, what's the economic value of your freedom? What would you pay to ensure that your children or grandchildren could never be bought and sold like property? She paused, letting the question settle before continuing. But if you want concrete numbers, trafficking generates an estimated $150 billion in profits annually. The enforcement mechanisms in this bill would cost less than $2 billion per year to implement. That's not just a sound investment, it's a moral imperative. The hearing concluded with closing statements from committee members, most of whom expressed support for the legislation. But Sarah knew that support in a hearing room didn't guarantee action. The real work would happen in the coming weeks, as advocates lobbied individual senators and built coalitions to push the bill forward. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah found herself approached by a young woman who had been sitting in the back row. She was probably in her early 20s, with the careful posture and watchful eyes that Sarah recognized in survivors. Ms. Mitchell, the woman said hesitantly, my name is Jessica Barnes. I was at a facility in Oregon. They closed it down 3 months ago because of your work. Sarah felt the familiar mix of joy and sorrow that came with meeting newly freed survivors. Joy at their liberation, sorrow for what they had endured. How are you doing, Jessica? Sarah asked gently. Are you getting the support you need? Jessica nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Counseling helps. The job training program is good. But I wanted to thank you personally. When the agents came to get us, they told us about you and the others, about how you'd fought back. It gave us hope. You gave yourself hope, Sarah corrected. I just helped create opportunities for you to use it. They talked for several more minutes, with Sarah providing information about additional resources and support networks. As Jessica walked away, Sarah reflected on how these personal connections remained the most meaningful part of her work. Later that evening, Sarah joined Jack and Margaret Crawford for dinner at a quiet restaurant near the Capitol. The conversation naturally turned to the ranch and the survivors who had made it their permanent home. Elena's been working with a group of children who were rescued from agricultural operations, Margaret reported. Her maternal instincts and trauma experience make her incredibly effective. Several kids who hadn't spoken in months are starting to open up. And Rebecca, Sarah asked about her former fellow worker at Blackwood Industries. Law school, Jack replied, with obvious pride. Full scholarship to Georgetown. She wants to specialize in human trafficking prosecution. As they discussed the various paths their fellow survivors had taken, Sarah marveled at the transformation that had occurred in all their lives. People who had been reduced to property had reclaimed not just their freedom, but their power to shape the world around them. What about you? Margaret asked as the evening wound down. Any thoughts about what comes next? Sarah considered the question carefully. The policy work was important, the rescue operations were necessary, but she felt drawn towards something more comprehensive, a way to address the root causes that made people vulnerable to trafficking in the first place. I've been thinking about education, she said finally. Prevention programs in schools, community organizations, places where potential victims might learn to recognize and avoid dangerous situations. That's ambitious, Jack observed. Educational initiatives require sustained funding, political support, and cultural change. So did dismantling a trafficking network that included senators and federal judges, Sarah replied with a smile. If we can do that, we can certainly teach people how to protect themselves and their communities. As they walked back to their hotel, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility that came with her public role. Tomorrow, she would return to Montana to prepare for the upcoming rescue operations. Next month, she would testify before another congressional committee. Next year, she might be launching a national education initiative. But tonight, she was simply Sarah Mitchell, a woman who had survived something unimaginable and chosen to use that survival to help others. The brand on her shoulder was still there, still visible when she chose to show it, but it no longer defined her. She was no longer the girl who had been marked as property. She was a woman who had transformed trauma into purpose, who had turned her deepest wounds into sources of strength for others. She was a survivor, an advocate, a fighter for justice, and she was just getting started. 5 years later, Sarah stood on the steps of the newly opened National Trafficking Survivors Education Center in Denver, watching as hundreds of people gathered for the dedication ceremony. The building behind her represented something that had once seemed impossible, a comprehensive institution, designed and operated entirely by survivors, for survivors. "It's bigger than I imagined," Elena said, joining Sarah on the steps. Elena now served as the center's director of trauma recovery, her natural empathy having been refined through years of formal training and practical experience. "Everything's bigger than we imagined back then," Sarah replied, thinking of how their desperate escape from a Utah facility had grown into a nationwide movement that had fundamentally changed how America addressed human trafficking. The Trafficking Survivors Protection Act had passed Congress 18 months after Sarah's testimony, with bipartisan support that surprised even its most optimistic advocates. But the real victory wasn't legislative, it was cultural. The conversation around trafficking had shifted from viewing victims as criminals or objects of pity to recognizing them as experts whose lived experience was invaluable in fighting the crime. Governor Patricia Wells of Colorado approached the podium as the crowd settled. The governor herself was a survivor of domestic trafficking who had rebuilt her life through education and public service, a testament to the power of comprehensive support systems. 20 years ago, Governor Wells began, I was a teenager trapped in a situation I thought I'd never escape from. 10 years ago, that seemed like a shameful secret I'd carry forever. Today, it's the foundation of my authority to say that no one, absolutely no one, should ever be treated as property. The crowd erupted in applause, but Sarah found her attention drawn to a small group standing near the back. They were clearly new survivors. She could tell by their posture, the way they stayed close together, the cautious hope in their eyes. The center's outreach teams had rescued them from operations in Nevada and Arizona just weeks earlier. After the ceremony, Sarah made her way to the group. They were part of what she now called the third generation of survivors, people freed by operations that had been planned and executed by survivors themselves, rather than traditional law enforcement. "Welcome to Denver," Sarah said to a young woman who appeared to be the group's informal leader. "I'm Sarah Mitchell." "I know who you are," the woman replied, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and skepticism. "I'm Rosa Gutierrez. They told us about you during debriefing." "About how you started all this," Sarah shook her head. "I didn't start anything. I just refused to let it end with me." Over the next hour, she toured the center with Rosa and her companions, showing them facilities that represented 5 years of innovation in survivor services. The medical clinic was staffed entirely by survivor doctors who understood trauma from both professional and personal perspectives. The legal aid office was run by attorneys who had once been victims themselves. The job training programs were designed by people who had rebuilt their own careers from nothing. "How many people work here?" asked Miguel, one of Rosa's companions. 347 staff members, Sarah replied. 80% are trafficking survivors. The rest are allies who've proven their commitment to survivor-led approaches. But the center's most innovative feature was the Prevention Institute, where Sarah now spent most of her time. The institute had developed educational programs that were being implemented in schools, community centers, and online platforms across the country. The goal wasn't just to teach people how to avoid trafficking, it was to build communities that made trafficking impossible. The best rescue operation, Sarah explained to the group, is the one that never has to happen because people were never trafficked in the first place. Later that evening, Sarah attended a smaller gathering in Jack and Margaret Crawford's hotel suite. The Crawfords had officially retired from active rescue work, but they remained deeply involved in policy and training initiatives. Their ranch in Montana had been expanded into a full campus that served as the movement's unofficial headquarters. "Any regrets?" Margaret asked as the evening wound down. It was a question she'd posed to Sarah several times over the years, and the answer had evolved as Sarah's role in the movement had grown. "About the work? Never," Sarah replied. "About the time it's taken away from building a normal life. Sometimes." It was an honest answer. Sarah was 35 now, and her romantic relationships had been complicated by the demands of her advocacy work and the trauma that still occasionally surfaced despite years of therapy. She'd never married, never had children, though she'd found family among the community of survivors she worked with daily. "But then I think about Rosa and Miguel and all the others," Sarah continued, "about the fact that they'll have opportunities we never had because we were willing to fight for them. That makes everything worthwhile." Tommy joined the conversation from his position by the window, where he'd been monitoring communications traffic. "Speaking of fighting," he said, "Diana's picking up intelligence about new operations forming in Texas and Florida. Looks like some of the old networks are trying to rebuild." Sarah felt the familiar surge of energy that came with the hunt. Despite her success in policy and education work, field operations remained her first love. There was something deeply satisfying about personally dismantling the systems that preyed on vulnerable people. "How soon?" she asked. 2 weeks. Jake wants a full survivor-led operation. Show the new generation how it's done." Sarah nodded, already planning the logistics. In her mind, the protocols they'd developed over 5 years had made their operations highly effective while minimizing risk to both rescuers and victims. They'd learned to use their unique understanding of trafficking psychology as a tactical advantage. "One more time," Margaret said with a mixture of pride and concern. "Promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," Sarah replied, meaning it. She'd learned the difference between calculated risks and reckless endangerment. The work was still dangerous, but it was no longer the desperate improvisation of their early operations. As the gathering dispersed, Sarah found herself alone with Jack Crawford on the hotel's balcony, looking out over the Denver skyline. The city below them was home to thousands of survivors who had rebuilt their lives through programs that hadn't existed 5 years earlier. "What do you think your daughter would say about all this?" Sarah asked quietly. It was a question she'd never dared ask before, but their relationship had deepened over the years into something approaching that of father and daughter. Jack was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I think she'd be proud that her parents didn't let grief destroy them, that we found a way to honor her memory by protecting other people's children." He paused, then added, "But I also think she'd tell us that revenge was never the point. Justice was, and justice means building something better, not just tearing down something evil." As Sarah returned to her own hotel room that night, she reflected on how far she'd traveled from the desperate girl who had been branded like cattle in a Nevada labor camp. The physical scar was still there, still visible when she chose to show it during speaking engagements or congressional testimony, but it no longer represented ownership or shame. It represented survival. It represented the refusal to be broken. It represented the transformation of trauma into purpose, of victimhood into power, of individual suffering into collective action. Tomorrow, she would return to her work at the center, continuing to build systems that made trafficking less profitable and rescue more effective. In 2 weeks, she would lead another operation to free people who were experiencing the same horrors she had survived. But tonight, Sarah Mitchell was simply a free woman in a free country, surrounded by people who loved her and supported by institutions she had helped to create. She was no longer property. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor who had kept the promise she'd made to herself in that first moment of freedom, to ensure that no one else would bear the marks of slavery in silence. The girl who had been branded like cattle was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had transformed the very meaning of those brands, turning symbols of ownership into badges of survival, resistance, and hope. And that transformation had changed not just her own life, but the lives of thousands of others who would never know the terror of being treated as property, because Sarah Mitchell and countless others like her had refused to let that terror go unchallenged. The fight for human dignity was far from over, but it was a fight that soldiers would never lack, because every person who had been freed became a warrior in the battle to free others. That was Sarah's true legacy, not just her own survival, but the movement she had helped to build, the lives she had helped to save, and the future she had helped to create, where freedom was not a privilege to be granted, but a right to be defended. Up next, you got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.